Now, let us begin in 360 BC. And here is Plato writing in the voice of Socrates in his book, The Republic. Imagine an underground chamber like a cave, with a long entrance open to the daylight and as wide as the cave. In this chamber are men who have been prisoners since they were children, their legs and necks so fastened that they can only look straight ahead of them and cannot turn their heads. Some way off and higher up, a fire is burning, and between the fire and the prisoners and above them runs a road, in front of which a curtain wall has been built, like the screen at puppet shows between the operators and their audience, above which they show their puppets. I see, says Glaucon, Socrates' interlocutor. Imagine further that there are men carrying all sorts of gear along behind the curtain wall, projecting above it and including figures of men and animals made of wood and stone and all sorts of other materials. And that some of these men, as you would expect, are talking and some are not. An odd picture and an odd sort of prisoner, says Glaucon. They are drawn from life, Plato continues. For tell me, do you think our prisoners could see anything of themselves or their fellows except the shadows thrown by the fire on the wall of the cave opposite them? How could they see anything else if they were prevented from moving their heads all their lives? And would they see anything more of the projected objects carried along the road? Of course not. Then if they were able to talk to each other, would they not assume that the shadows they saw were the real things? Inevitably. And if the wall of the prison opposite them reflected sound, don't you think they would suppose whenever one of the passers-by on the road spoke that the voice belonged to the shadow passing before them? They would be bound to think so. Now, the film from which I showed you an extract, Shadow Procession, was made in 1999 for the Istanbul Biennale, and it was designed to be shown in the underground Yerebatan cistern of that city. It uses a technique of jointed paper puppets moved frame by frame under the camera. The torn pieces of paper are joined with little twists of wire. Its origins are in puppet theater, using flat cutout figures either as silhouettes in front of the screen or as shadows cast onto the screen. Plato continues. And so in every way they would believe that the shadows of the object we mentioned were the whole truth. Yes, inevitably, agrees Glaucon. Then think what would naturally happen to them if they were released from their bonds and cured of their delusions. Suppose one of them were let loose and suddenly compelled to stand up and turn his head and look and walk towards the fire. All these actions would be painful, and he would be too dazzled to see properly the objects of which he used to see the shadows. What do you think he would say if he was told that he was now nearer reality and seeing more correctly because he was turned towards the objects that were more real? And if on top of that he were compelled to say what each of the passing objects was when pointed out to him, don't you think he would be at a loss and think that what he used to see was far truer than the objects now being pointed out to him? Yes, far truer. And if he were made to look directly at the light of the fire, it would hurt his eyes and he would turn back and retreat to the things which he could see properly, which he would think really clearer than the things being shown him. Now, the paper characters in Shadow Procession, the film, formed on one hand an inventory of people on the move. A man walking while reading, miners carrying a broken city, pensioners carried in wheelbarrows, an inventory of specific people seen in newspapers, in the news, and on the streets of Johannesburg. But the film was about amplitude rather than the specific nature of a particular journey. A catalogue of people on the move. I was interested in how roughly a figure could be torn and still be understood. How crudely it could be moved and still have coherence as a moving, specific person. Plato continues. And if, he continues, he were forcibly dragged up the steep and rugged ascent and not let go till he had been dragged out into the sunlight, the process would be a painful one, to which he would much object. And when he emerged into the light, his eyes would be so dazzled by the glare that he wouldn't be able to see a single one of the things he was now told were real. Certainly not at first, Glaucon agrees. Now, the question of shadows was posed in practical terms. How to achieve an image, not a thought. How to achieve shadows and movement. I think my interest in procession started with seeing the Goya image, the procession of the Holy Office, and the pilgrimage to San Isidro. The crowd moving from the depths of the picture plane towards the surface towards us. With shadows, the forward movement of an image becomes problematic. You have a light source and you have an object blocking the light. As the crowd moves forward towards the light, its shadow gets larger and larger till it obliterates the entire screen. Its forward movement has very limited forward flexibility. Whereas with a lateral movement, while it does reduce the mass to an itemized list, it does enable a continuation, a sense of an ongoing procession, to be clear. Plato's crowd of necessity has to be a lateral procession, observed neither advancing nor retreating, simply passing. Because, of course, Plato continues, he would need to grow accustomed to the light before he could see things in the upper world, outside the cave. First, he would find it easiest to look at the shadows, next at the reflections of men and other objects in water, and later on at the objects themselves. After that, he would find it easier to observe the heavenly bodies and the sky itself at night, and to look at the light of the moon and stars rather than at the sun and its light by day, of course. The thing he would be able to do last would be to look directly at the sun itself and gaze at it without using reflections in water or any other medium, but as and in itself. That must come last, says Glaucon. Later on, he would come to the conclusion that it is the sun that produces the changing seasons and years and controls everything in the visible world, and is in a sense responsible for everything that he and his fellow prisoners used to see. That is the conclusion he would inevitably reach. Here suffice it to say that while making the film Shadow Procession, I could not find a destination that felt possible. The procession could not end with a fête galante on the island of Cythera, like Watteau. It could not arrive at a civic state, as in David, nor could it arrive at a collective farm. We have now reached a point where all destinations, all bright lights, arouse our mistrust. The light at the end of the tunnel we are all too familiar turns so quickly into an interrogator's spotlight. And when he thought of his first home, continues Plato in the voice of Socrates, and what passed for wisdom there, and of his fellow prisoners, don't you think he would congratulate himself on his good fortune and be sorry for them? Very much so. From this, Plato tells us, comes the ethical imperative of the philosopher. The man who has seen the light and apprehended and understood the forms that follow from it has a duty to return to the cave, to unshackle those in darkness and bring them up from the cave into light. And if necessary, this must be done with force. The nexus of enlightenment, emancipation, and violence emerges. We have set our agenda.